Ariel's just given us a really clear and detailed overview of the Vennerite rebellion. I'm just going to talk about Thomas Venner in the context of some of the sort of theoretical frameworks. I'll just start and we'll see how we go. Okay. As we've already heard, on the 6th of January 1661, Thomas Venner and about 50 of his comrades set out to occupy old St. Paul's Cathedral. They chanted King Jesus and the heads upon the gate. They shot a passerby who declared his fidelity to King Charles and fended off an attack from a train band before retreating to Highgate. 2 days later, they launched an attack in the city of London, and having killed 20 soldiers and lost 26 of their own, the uprising ended with many of their number in shackles. The followers of Thomas Venner were Fifth-Monarchists, and they held fast to their belief that the reign of the Fifth Monarchy, the reign of King Jesus, was imminent. It had, after all, been heralded by the execution of the tyrant Charles Stuart. But by 1661, the monarchy had been restored, and the victories of the godly party had been exposed as Pyrrhic, and Cromwell himself exposed as more Achan than Moses. The Fifth-Monarchists appeared to have been proven wrong, misguided, and even foolish. In light of this, it appears strange that these people would hold on to their millenarian beliefs with such tenacity, or even that they would demonstrate a kind of commitment that they had not done so during more promising times. In the preceding comments, I just want to really reflect on the extent to which existing scholarship about the failure of prophecy, from Festinger, Melton, Zygmunt, and others, maps onto the experience of the Vennerites and the Fifth-Monarchists more generally. Given the detail offered by Ariel in his talk, it's not necessary to give a full exposition of the history of the Vennerites and the Fifth-Monarchists in general, nor does time allow. But there are three crucial things that I think it's important to stress. The first is that the power of the Fifth-Monarchists' prophecy and their prophetic beliefs was founded on one single central event, the execution of King Charles. Very little else bound them together, either doctrinally or socially. They came from quite disparate social groups. They believed lots of different things. Many of them were Baptists, some others. Some were very antagonistic towards Quakers. Others later on apparently joined Quaker movement. So the central thing that bound them together was this belief in the providential significance of the execution of the regicide. The second, maybe more fundamental belief is a conviction that history was providential, and that the violent events that had taken place in the preceding decade were guided by the hand of God. And the third, perhaps even more fundamental, was the belief implicit in Fifth-Monarchist thought that there existed a thing called progress. These three core beliefs or sensibilities proved to be highly problematic when the Fifth-Monarchists were faced with the restoration of the monarchy in 1660. The central moment of Fifth-Monarchist belief, as I've said, was the execution of King Charles. The execution provided the most clear affirmation of the validity of Fifth-Monarchist prophecy, and as such was revisited by Fifth-Monarchists throughout the interregnum to reassure them of the legitimacy of their cause. Fifth-Monarchists and many other of their peers believed that the death of Charles was the start of something rather than the end of something. John Durrant suggested that in a few years a man may in sober speech ask, where is the King of England? Where is the King of France? Where is the King of Spain? Where are the Danish, the Swedish and the Hungarian? Hugh Peter called on the grandees of the army to export their righteous battle against monarchy. This army, he said, must root up monarchy not only here but in France and in other kingdoms around about. This army is that cornerstone cut out of the mountain which will dash the powers of the earth to pieces. That Fifth-Monarchism was essentially a violent movement is demonstrable not in the fact that they frequently engaged in acts of violent sedition, in the main they didn't, but rather in the fact that they were defined, both from within and without, by their identification with the legitimization of political violence. This position is probably most succinctly articulated in Killing No Murder, a pseudonymously published text of 1657, which laid out the argument for the legitimacy of the assassination of Cromwell. In the text it says, "'Tis always lawful to kill thieves, whom we can bring to know the justice, and not only lawful and to do ourselves right, but glorious and to deserve of mankind, to free the world of that common robber, that universal pirate, under whom and for whom the lesser beasts prey. This firebrand I would have any way extinguished. This ulcer I would have any hand to lance. John Jones in 1656 preached that it was not murder to kill such as are enemies of Michael your prince. And at the rally of Fifth-Monarchists, which accompanied the funeral of John Pendarves, a discussion was held on the motion whether God's people must be a bloody people. But equally central to the Fifth-Monarchist mentality was the belief that violence was providentially ordained. Retroactive proof of the legitimacy of Charles' execution was found in the prophecies of Lady Eleanor Douglas. John Rogers was keen to point out that the saints must be at it when they have the call. He meant violence rather than anything else. Even as the author of Killing No Murder was calling for the assassination of Cromwell, he couched it in purely providential terms. I cannot but doubt, but God will suddenly sanctify some hand to do it and bring down that bloody and deceitful man who lives not only to the misery but to the infamy of our nation. Fifth Monarchists believed that any victory that was brought about by violence was demonstrably favoured providentially. When the Fifth Monarchists were attacked by soldiers at the funeral of John Pendarves, the cry went up, "Lord, appear now or never for the confounding of these, thine and our enemies." John James at his execution said that Christ would use his people in his hand as his battle axe. John Rogers cautioned against advancing the saints' cause militarily before the appointed time, saying, "To such as are impatient and rash, tarry till the time of the end. It will be soon enough. And if thou lookst to the kingdom work before the time and the season, thou art more capable of being out down with the grass than of cutting down the grass." John Cant said that the saints should remain in their chambers until they received unequivocal signs of the appointed time. The third and maybe more fundamental aspect of Fifth Monarchist thought, which in some ways informed the previous two aspects, was the belief in the concept of progress. This might seem like a fairly intuitive thing to believe in, but the ethos of hereditary monarchy, of feudalism, of universal established church with uniform rituals, liturgical calendars, etc., was oriented more towards stability and constancy rather than to progress. It was the millenarians of the 17th century, themselves drawing on ideas rooted in Joachimism and with other influences, who first embraced the idea that they would die in a world that was unrecognisably different from the world they had been born into. All of these beliefs, to some extent, hinged on the death of Charles Stuart. When on the 29th of May, another Charles Stuart marched into London, Pepys claimed that all the world is in a merry mood because of the King's coming. But for those who believed that the abolition of the monarchy was a step towards a glorious millennial future, this strange reversal presented them with confusion and disappointment at best, and outright crisis at worst. It certainly presented those who held on to their beliefs in the prophecy with a contradiction between the world as they perceived it and the world as it appeared to be. John Gordon Melton writes, "The failure of prophecy generally shocks believers to some extent. Disappointment is real, as is a threat to the group's survival. Life cannot return immediately to the norm. Some means must be found to reaffirm the validity of the group and the truth of its beliefs. Some action must be taken to repair the social fabric torn." The first scholar to undertake research into the reaction of groups to the failure of prophecy was Festinger, who in his by now famous / infamous study of the followers of Marianne Keech, who greeted the failure of a prophesied flying saucer to appear by proselytizing rather than apostatizing, concluded that the individual will frequently emerge not only unshaken, but even more convinced of the truth of their beliefs than ever before. Indeed, he may even show a new fervour about convincing and converting others to his view. Festinger's hypothesis has come under significant criticism by many, not least Anthony van Vossen and Tim Jenkins, who have both argued that the social scientists involved in the study presume the normativity of their own perspective on events. There's also been something of a replication failure for social scientists who've examined prophecy failure, starting with the study conducted by Hardike and Braden only a few years after the publication of Festinger's When Prophecy Fails. Joseph Zygmunt, after a series of studies containing the failure of prophecy in Jehovah's Witnesses communities, came to the conclusion that the response of disconfirmation within a group is largely informed by the organisational resources at the disposal of the group itself. Depending on the nature of the prophecy and the nature of the group's structure, groups have drawn upon a variety of adaptive strategies. However, the group always has to respond in some way to the disconfirmation. Zygmunt identified 3 key modes of adaptation: acknowledgement of the error, blaming members of the group or outsiders for the failure of the prophecy to be consummated, or the refusal to accept failure and the reformulation of the prophecy in more unfalsifiable terms. It is the latter strategy that provided the focus of the scholarship of Melton, who argued that in reality prophecy seldom fails. Simon Dean's study of the Lubavitcher community in Stamford Hill and Crown Heights led him to similar conclusions. He recorded several different responses to Lubavitcher Hasidism, of the Lubavitcher Hasidim to the death of Menachem Schneerson. Some believed that the death of Schneerson itself heralded a new messianic era. They believed initially that he was the Messiah, possibly. Some believed that it heralded a new messianic era. Others looked forward to his resurrection. Some lamented that the Messiah was not able to reveal himself because of the faithlessness of the world. These attitudes all constitute different strategies of adaptation, seeking to maintain the status quo and to reinforce the unfalsifiability of the prophecy. I guess it would be remiss in a way, given the setting of the conference, not to mention a classic example of this, which is the response of George Turner to the death of Joanna Southcott. Probably many here are aware that Southcott predicted that she would give birth to a boy named Shiloh, who would be the Messiah. But unfortunately, Southcott died a few weeks after the date that she had appointed for the birth of Shiloh. Within days of this apparently irrefutable disconfirmation, George Turner, a former follower of Richard Brothers, began to disseminate his belief that Shiloh had in fact been taken straight to heaven before being born, without the messy process of birth and living on this earth. So these are all modes of adaptation. So I just want to focus on that fundamental idea, which all the scholars discussed above agree. Some means must be found to reaffirm the validity of the group and the truth of its beliefs. Some action must be taken to repair the social fabric torn. I think probably the fundamental question then is, to what extent can the meeting of can the Declaration at Breda, Monk's intervention, the Convention Parliament in 1660, the 8th of May proclamation and the inauguration of Oak Apple Day constitute a disconfirmation of Fifth-Monarchist prophecy? Bernard Capp, in his study on Fifth-Monarchists, called the cessation of the monarchy the central pillar of Fifth-Monarchist faith. It's for this reason, he writes, that the prophetic non-fulfillments of the 1650s had been disappointing, but that the Restoration shattered all. The text, entitled A Door of Hope, was published in 1660, and it confesses in its opening lines that most are confused by God's good and great designs. Seems clear from this testimony, at least, that the Fifth Monarchists themselves did indeed acknowledge the possibility that the Restoration could be considered a direct disconfirmation of some of their beliefs. So how did they respond? The first is to say that in keeping with Melton's conclusions, many Fifth Monarchists retained millenarian convictions, if not necessarily their militancy. Henry Danvers' Theopolis, published as late as 1672, so a decade after the Restoration, described the city of God that would soon be founded. Benjamin Stoneham wrote an alarum to the churches and professors around a similar theme. Vavasor Powell, who's the leader of the Fifth Monarchists in North Wales, appeared to think that the disappointment was only temporary, and he said, let none marvel that a cloud covers and hides the splendour of the stars when there hath been such an eclipse upon the sun. No more than such small suffering should befall the saints when the Son of God did suffer so much. Many employed the strategy which I referred to before, which Zygmunt refers to as this organisational recycling, the deferment of the date of prophetic consummation to a later date. This is something that Ariel talked about. Camshaw Helm claimed to have seen visions in Honiton in 1665. He was a deputy of Christopher Feake, who was one of the leaders of the Fifth Monarchists in London, probably the leader of the Fifth Monarchists in London, which he believed to be the sign of the imminence of the millennium. The ominous year 1666 sort of stimulated even more enthusiasm for the millennium. One text, the Panther Prophecy, which was written by Owen Lloyd, another Norwellian apocalyptic writer, offers a perfect encapsulation of this organisational recycling within Fifth Monarchist circles. Originally recorded in 1653, the prophecy records a vision in which a panther attracts the support of lawyers and ministers only to be eaten by it. The panther then, only for them to be eaten by it, sorry. The panther then attacks the poor people hiding in the forest only to be shot ultimately by Christ. The original readers of the prophecy, most notably John Rogers, interpreted the vision as an identification of Cromwell as a usurper and an agent of the man of sin. But when it was published in 1662, it was now seen as a depiction of the Restoration government. Zygmunt argues, as we've seen, that the restatement of prophecy, this organizational recycling, can function as kind of a jump lead to the movement, artificially keeping alive a movement in crisis and reinforcing common goals. A number of Fifth Monarchists resorted to the cognitive dissonance abating strategy, which Zygmunt refers to as the attribution of blame strategy. Zygmunt points to the examples in Jehovah's Witnesses in which the deferment of prophecy led to condemnation of members and also outside forces in failing to prepare sufficiently for the visible eschatological event. It appears that similar strategies were used by Fifth Monarchists in 1660. The author of The Memorial on the Death of Nathaniel Strange wrote, "We have sinned, and therefore our sin frustrate that was made." We have sinned, and therefore our sin frustrate was made that glorious design, and we are brought where we first did begin. The Door of Hope, the text I referred to before, begins with an apology suggesting that God allowed C.S. Charles Stewart to return to the throne, or to come to the throne, to punish and to spew out of his mouth a lukewarm people who had not a thorough spirit for the work, to try the faith and patience of his own people as pure gold, to conform them to their head, to redeem and separate them from all the rest by choice distinguishing characters. Zygmunt claims that in such instances, proselytizing endeavour is likely to become more genuinely agitational in character. Other forms of aggressive action against established authorities and groups may be undertaken in the same context, often triggering open conflict between them. We must remember that the Fifth Monarchists, we must remember who the Fifth Monarchists turned their violence on. The Vennerite plot appeared to be an outpouring of violence against the city of London as a whole. The first victim of Vennerite violence was a passerby who declared his support for the king. A small band of Fifth Monarchists did not apparently have a strategic target in mind, a strategic plan in mind, but rather to cut down forces of the state in the city of London. This tallies somewhat with the initial statement that we find in the Door of Hope. "And we, being called of God and cut out without hands, or humane contrivance, in whom is shown forth his power," this providential idea again, "rise up on God's behalf, free from the guilt of the breach of the oaths and covenants upon our conscience, to conflict with this profane persecuting spirit of the dragon, and the worshippers of the beast that dwell on the earth. And we call all that have a life to lay down for their King and Saviour, to come forth against them with a sword, and execute upon them the judgments written." It appears that the Vennerites themselves saw violence, specifically fanatical violence, the word that was often used, the sort of designation that was often used by their enemies, as maybe having a special significance, since it demonstrated the strength of their conviction. It also exhibited the marginality of their cause within a wider society. This too was appropriated as a positive prophetic consummation. In the Door of Hope it says, are you a poor despised remnant? Why, God has formed you for himself. As Christ was a tender plant and a root out of dry ground, so may his kingdom arise out of a pure, obscure, illiterate, and, such as the world calls, fanatic people. And out of them shall come forth the corner, the nail, the battle bow. We look for a righteous spiritual magistracy out of the new sharp threshing instrument. One might imagine that the Vennerites would believe that their seemingly Sisyphean rebellion would trigger a miraculous victory, which would provide them with some kind of indication that they really believed in this kind of in a very real kind of providential intervention. But the strange thing is that the Vennerites at least did not believe that their small movement would be vindicated by this kind of deus ex machina. They explicitly, in fact, refute this idea in A Door of Hope, where it says, "Some may be ready simply and ignorantly, and others willfully to mistake and misapprehend us. Some to malicious ends, not knowing what we mean by the kingdom of Christ, as if some strange thing contrary to the sound hope of the gospel and doctrine of the true primitive church, and not in scripture and reason, were intended, as that Christ should immediately appear to head an army. We shall therefore throw that stone out of your way." There are two broad reasons for rising up in 1661. One would be to change something about the external political reality. The other would be to change something about oneself or the group that one belongs to. And it seems unlikely to me that the Vennerites believed that with such small numbers they could easily affect political change. As such, this leaves the second option. It seems, therefore, that the disconfirmation that the Restoration provided created the necessary conditions for the violent response of the Vennerites and for other members of the Fifth Monarchy movement. they felt that some extreme and demonstrative reaffirmation of commitment to the prophecy was required of them. And demonstrating that they themselves were exactly the fanatics that they had been criticised as being, formed that narrative. What was it that made it difficult for them to perform the kind of organisational recycling that other groups do when faced with this kind of disconfirmation? One suggestion that comes from the study conducted by Hardike and Braden that I referred to before on the True Word Millenarian group, who went into seclusion in anticipation of a nuclear disaster. The conclusion of that study suggested that the failure of the Festinger hypothesis rested on the lack of ridicule and marginalisation that the True Word group experienced at the hands of the majority in society. Conversely, they predicted that groups who experience more ridicule would go to greater lengths to dispel cognitive dissonance. This was certainly the case with the Fifth-Monarchists. Whilst many in society and in the government were wary of the threat posed by dissidents, the Fifth-Monarchists were also pretty roundly mocked by their peers. Abraham Cowley's The Cutter of Coleman Street portrayed a wooer who affected apocalyptic visions of himself riding into London on a purple camel and of the Westminster Hall walking into the Thames. The Holy Sisters Conspiracy, another play at the same time, portrayed a group of Fifth-Monarchist women who yearned for the sexual freedom which the promiscuous Fifth-Monarchist congregations promised. Again, this is a kind of conflation of Anabaptist tropes which we use to criticise Anabaptists. Okay, 1 minute. Each of these plays played to packed houses in London. Moreover, the Fifth-Monarchists, possibly the reason is the Fifth-Monarchists did not appear to have the structures in place which allowed them for long-term organisational recycling. As Capp points out, the saints were waiting in expectation for what they believed to be an imminent world revolution, and as such they spent little time, unlike other Baptists, Congregationalists, Quakers, etc., in creating lasting national organisations or general declarations of faith. As such, there was very little to fall back on when the cataclysmic disconfirmation which the Restoration represented occurred. Whatever the reasons, it seems like the violent uprising of 1661 and the ecstatic violent literature that heralded it served in some way to mend the social fabric torn by the disconfirmation of the Restoration, even if it did not bring about the reign of King Jesus. Thank you.
Thank you, Aiden. Thank you very much. Time for a few quick questions for Aiden. Anyone? Yep, one over there, sir.
I have a question. I'm not sure if it falls under your research, but I'm interested in 1666 comes about, Fire of London. Was that the scene of any more millenarian activity, and were the Fifth-Monarchists still around by then?
Yeah, so there's a number of Fifth-Monarchists who see the Fire of London as having this kind of apocalyptic significance, but as you can imagine, that kind of wears thin as the years go on, and then that becomes deferred to 1670 for a number of them, and then obviously in the 1690s again. So periodically throughout that period you have this deferment of the consummation of the prophecy, yeah. But yeah, Fire of London and the plague as well. Yeah.
Chris?
So just let me be clear. So you think that in fact the study of Fifth Monarchy is different from the study of every other group that we listened to talked about today, because this was a set of ideas which were held by individuals across a wide variety of different groups.
Yeah, I think there's that, and I think also there's this kind of it sits outside of some of the kind of models that we might be familiar with, because I think it sits within this liminal space in between the kind of determined and the voluntary. So they had retrospectively validated the violence that they'd committed previously in the context of this providential map. So then that leaves them in this strange position where they're waiting for some kind of sign that they're going to participate in this providential violence again, but it's who's going to initiate it, God or them? So you have Fifth-Monarchists like John Rogers who are actively saying we need to wait, and then the Vennerites who are sort of saying that.
Could you just answer a question which I don't know the answer to? I'd be interested to know.
Yeah.
Was Cromwell a Fifth-Monarchist then?
No. So Cromwell, believed that there was providential significance, obviously, to the Civil War, but didn't. But he was, very wary of what he saw as intrinsically a violent movement, and the marginalisation of Harrison and other people who were prominent Fifth Monarchists speaks to the fact that that he was very wary of them as a movement. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Aiden. Thank you.